Picture a wave of cheap glide bombs, each one costing less than a new pickup truck, closing on one of the most powerful surface combatants ever built. The math looks obvious. Flood the zone with enough of them and something gets through. Something always gets through. And when it does, the damage should be catastrophic. Except it isn't. Not the way the math predicts. Not against an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. Here's the paradox at the center of this breakdown. A weapon that costs $20,000 can force a navy to spend $2 million stopping it. And that economic logic is brutally real, driving procurement decisions from Washington to Beijing right now. But that same cheap weapon, if it somehow clears every layer of defense and actually strikes the hull, may not sink the ship, may not even put it out of action. The economic exchange ratio runs one way. The physics of putting 9,000 tons of warship on the ocean floor runs in an entirely different direction. And the two have almost nothing to do with each other. That gap, between bankrupting a fleet and destroying it, is what this breakdown is about. Stay with us, because the answer matters more than almost any other question in Pacific naval strategy today. The Arleigh Burke-class is the workhorse of the United States Navy's surface fleet. The first ship, USS Arleigh Burke herself, commissioned in 1991. By the mid-2020s, the class had grown to over 70 hulls in commission, with more under construction. No other surface combatant in the world has been built in those numbers at that capability level in the same generation. Flight I ships displaced around 8,500 tons full load. The Flight 3A and Flight 3 variants push past 9,200 tons. They are not small ships. What makes an Arleigh Burke distinctive is not size alone. The defining feature is the Aegis combat system, a phased array radar and integrated fire control architecture developed originally by RCA, refined over 4 decades by Lockheed Martin and the Navy's own program offices, and now in its Baseline 9 and Baseline 10 iterations on the newest hulls. The AN/SPY-6 radar on Flight 3 ships is roughly 18 times more sensitive than the AN/SPY-1D it replaces. That matters enormously when the incoming threat is a small, low-observable glide bomb flying at low altitude with a minimal radar cross-section. The ship carries a 96-cell MiG-41 vertical launch system on the newest variants. Those cells hold Standard Missile 2 for medium-range air defense, Standard Missile 6 for long-range engagement out beyond 300 kilometers, evolved Sea Sparrow missiles for shorter-range work, and Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. On top of all that sits the Rolling Airframe Missile System, RAM, for close-in defense, and at the very last ring, the Phalanx CIWS, a 20mm, 6-barrel M61 Vulcan rotary cannon firing 4,500 rounds per minute on its own closed-loop radar track. The ship does not need a human in the loop to engage with Phalanx. It detects, tracks, and fires autonomously. Now set against that picture the thing planners in Beijing, and in Washington, have been thinking about since at least 2015, the glide bomb swarm. Not a single precision weapon. A wave. Many cheap munitions, released from standoff distance, gliding unpowered or semi-powered toward the target, saturating the defense by sheer number. The most widely discussed example in open-source analysis uses munitions in roughly the $20,000 to $50,000 range per unit. That is not a precise figure for any specific Chinese system. Actual costs in the People's Liberation Army Navy's inventory are classified and estimates vary. But it is the bracket most independent defense economists use when modeling this scenario. A single SM-6 interceptor costs somewhere around $4 million per round in recent procurement. An ESSM Block 2 runs roughly $1.5 million. Even at the low end, you are burning interceptors worth 50 to 100 times the value of what you are shooting at. That asymmetry is real. It is not hype. But here is where the story gets complicated. Put yourself in the Combat Information Center of an Arleigh Burke, say USS John Finn, DDG-113, one of the Flight High IA ships currently operating in the Pacific. The tactical picture shows inbound contacts, not 1, not 3, a wave. The question the commanding officer faces is not simply, can we engage these? It is, which of these do we engage with what, in what order, and what do we hold in reserve? This is the saturation problem, and it has been the central challenge for surface air defense since the Falklands in 1982, when HMS Sheffield was struck by a single exocet. The ship's defense systems failed to engage in time. The lesson was not that the missile was invincible. The lesson was that a single gap in attention, a single failure of layering, A single moment of saturation is enough. What planners on both sides of the Pacific have spent the last decade working through is the math of layers versus numbers. An Arleigh Burke operating Aegis with SM-6 as the outer ring can begin engaging targets at very long range, beyond 100 kilometers in some engagement geometries. That first layer removes some of the wave. ESSM handles the leakers that close inside SM-6's optimal engagement envelope. RAM handles anything that gets past ESSM. Phalanx fires at what RAM misses. In theory, 4 distinct opportunities to defeat each incoming weapon. Here is what the math of saturation actually looks like. If a single layer has a 90% single-shot probability of kill against a given target, an optimistic figure for engagements against maneuvering, low observable threats, then one weapon has a 10% chance of getting through that layer. Against 2 independent layers in sequence, that drops to 1%. Against 4 layers, roughly 1 in 10,000. The numbers are seductive. They suggest near invulnerability. But probability of kill is not 90% against every target in every condition. Against a small, fast, low-flying munition with a reduced radar cross-section in an electronic warfare environment, with the ship maneuvering, sea clutter on the radar, the crew managing multiple tracks simultaneously, that number drops. And more critically, the number of simultaneous engagements any system can handle is finite. Aegis can track hundreds of contacts simultaneously, but the fire control channels available to prosecute simultaneous engagements are a much smaller number. This is the first genuine obstacle the defense faces. Not a single incoming weapon that beats the system by being brilliant, but many incoming weapons that beat the system by being numerous. The Aegis architecture was designed with this in mind, and the fire control system upgrades over the decades have specifically expanded the simultaneous engagement capacity. But there is always a ceiling, and the offensive planner's entire strategy is to find it. What's most surprising about this calculus isn't the engagement math itself. It's what happens after the magazine starts to run down. An Arleigh Burke at sea cannot reload at sea. The MiG-41 cells are loaded in port. Once they are expended, the ship must transit to a resupply facility. In a high-intensity conflict in the Western Pacific, that means leaving the fight. The strategic value of a glide bomb swarm, in this reading, is not the damage it inflicts per round. It is the depletion it forces. Drive the ship's magazine below a critical threshold, and you have achieved something close to the effect of sinking it, without sinking it. The question hanging over every Pacific wargame since roughly 2018 is, how many rounds does it take? The standard Arleigh Burke flight theory carries 96 MiG-41 cells. Those cells are not all loaded with interceptors. A typical loadout on a strike-capable deployment includes tomahawks, anti-submarine weapons, and other munitions alongside air defense missiles. A ship configured for air defense operations might carry something closer to 60 to 70 interceptors across SM-2, SM-6, and ESSM variants, with the rest of the cells devoted to RAM and other systems handled outside the MiG-41. The exact loadout is classified and varies by mission, but the ceiling is not unlimited. Now run the scenario. A wave of 40 incoming glide munitions. Within the logistical capacity of a modest standoff attack from multiple aircraft operating at range. Each interceptor fired costs between $1 and $4 million. If the layered defense operates at high efficiency and uses an average of 1.5 interceptors per incoming round, accounting for some dual engagement to ensure kill. The ship expends 60 interceptors to defeat 40 incoming weapons. That is a significant fraction of the air defense magazine. And the attacking force's cost for that wave? At $35,000 per glide munition, roughly $1.4 million total. One wave. 60 interceptors potentially expended. The attacking side spent $1.4 million. The defending side spent between $60 million and $240 million in interceptor value, depending on missile mix. And the ship is still afloat. Nothing has been sunk. But the magazine has been substantially reduced, and the next wave is already forming. This is the economic logic that has driven so much of the discussion in Washington over the last several years. It explains why the Navy's fiscal year 2024 and 2025 budget requests placed such emphasis on magazine depth, on increasing the number of interceptors available, on directed energy weapons that could provide effectively unlimited shots without per-round cost, on the Maritime Strike Tomahawk, and hypersonic weapons that could hold adversary launch platforms at risk before they release their munitions. It explains why distributed maritime operations, spreading the fleet so that no single ship is the focal point of all incoming fire, has moved from theoretical framework to operational doctrine. But here is where we need to separate the economic argument from the physical one, because the economic argument, compelling as it is, describes a navy being bankrupted. It does not describe a ship being sunk, and those are not the same thing. Let's talk about the physics of sinking a 9,000-ton warship with a glide bomb. A typical glide bomb in this class carries a warhead in the range of 50 to 100 kilograms of high explosive. Some designs, somewhat more, some less. That is a real weapon. Against an unarmored structure, a thin-skinned vessel, infrastructure, it is devastating. The same class of munition, or its powered cousin, the cruise missile with a similar warhead, has caused catastrophic damage to vessels in recent conflicts. The Houthi campaign in the Red Sea from 2023 onward demonstrated that commercial shipping, even large vessels, can be severely damaged or disabled by weapons in this class. And Arleigh Burke is not a commercial vessel. It is not a thin-skinned tanker or a container ship. It is a purpose-built warship with structural design that absorbed lessons from decades of damage control research, from the analysis of ships struck in combat, from shock testing and structural modeling. The hull is divided by watertight bulkheads into numerous compartments. Critical systems, propulsion, combat systems, damage control are distributed and redundant. Here is the concrete physics problem a 50 to 100 kilogram warhead faces when it strikes the hull of an Arleigh Burke. The ship displaces over 9,000 tons of water. To sink it, to cause it to lose enough buoyancy that it goes below the surface, you need to flood a substantial portion of its internal volume. A single warhead detonating on the exterior of the hull creates a hole. The size of that hole depends on the detonation location, the angle of impact, the fuse function, and whether the warhead penetrates before detonating or detonates on contact. Against the side of the hull at or near the waterline, with a contact or near-contact detonation, a 50-kilogram warhead creates a hole that can flood one or possibly two compartments if the blast is well placed. The ship has watertight integrity procedures. It has damage control parties trained to respond immediately. Counterflooding systems can be activated to manage list. The bilge pumps. High-capacity electric pumps on a warship are not what you find on a pleasure boat, are designed to cope with substantial flooding rates. The U.S. Navy's damage control training at surface warfare schools specifically models these scenarios. A well-drilled crew on an Arleigh Burke can manage flooding from a single hit, possibly from 2 or 3 hits, while maintaining propulsion and combat system operation. To actually sink the ship, not damage it, not reduce its combat effectiveness, not force it to break off the engagement, but put it on the ocean floor. With weapons in the $20,000 to $50,000 glide bomb class requires multiple hits in locations that collectively overwhelm the damage control capacity of the crew and the structural resilience of the hull. The number required is not publicly specified in classified naval analysis, but the open-source consensus among naval architects and defense researchers is that it is substantially more than 1, probably more than 3, and possibly 6 to 10 well-placed hits depending on location and fuse function. Here's the part that doesn't add up on the surface. The weapon cheap enough to bankrupt the defense isn't cheap enough to deliver that kind of cumulative damage through the defense. To guarantee 6 to 10 hits on a ship actively maneuvering under Aegis protection, with every layer of defense engaged, you need to send not 40 munitions in your wave, but several hundred. And at $35,000 each, several hundred munitions cost between $7 and $17 million. Still cheap compared to a $300 million destroyer, but now you are talking about a logistics and sortie rate challenge that is no longer trivial, even for a large air force. There is a detail that stuck with me when I went through the publicly available damage analysis from the USS Stark incident in 1987. The Stark was struck by 2 Exocet missiles, powered, guided weapons, not glide bombs, but roughly comparable in warhead mass, while operating in the Persian Gulf. The ship did not sink. 37 crew members were lost, and the damage was severe, but the ship was salvaged and eventually returned to service. The Exocet carries a 160-kilogram warhead, substantially heavier than the typical glide bomb in our scenario, and 2 of them, in sequence, against a warship of similar displacement class to an Arleigh Burke, did not achieve a sinking. That is not a reassuring data point about the safety of sailors. It is a data point about the physics. Modern warships at this displacement class are extraordinarily difficult to sink with anything short of a weapon specifically designed to defeat their structural resilience. A heavyweight torpedo detonating under the keel, creating a shockwave that breaks the ship's back, or a large anti-ship missile with a penetrating warhead designed to detonate deep inside the hull, or accumulated hits from multiple weapons that collectively overwhelm damage control capacity. This is why the asymmetric calculus in the South China Sea is more nuanced than the headline numbers suggest. The PLA Naval Air Force and the Rocket Force have invested heavily in DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles, weapons that approach from high altitude at hypersonic terminal velocities, with warheads designed to penetrate deep into the ship's structure before detonating. Those weapons cost in the range of $1 to $3 million each, not $20,000, and they are designed specifically to solve the physics problem the cheap glide bomb cannot solve. The expensive missile earns its cost by doing what the cheap one cannot, defeating not just the economic exchange ratio, but the structural physics of the target. Here's what this tells us about the current state of Pacific naval competition. Cheap and expensive weapons are not competing with each other in the same mission. They are going after different parts of the same problem. The cheap swarm attacks the magazine. The expensive precision weapon attacks the ship. Both are necessary for the attacker. Both create different defensive challenges. And the defender, the Arleigh Burke, the Aegis system, the crew, must answer both simultaneously. The raid was over in the economic model. The cheap glide bombs had drained the magazine. But the ship was still there. And now came the second question. What was the attacker going to do about that? This brings us to what I'd call the core strategic paradox that no procurement budget can fully resolve. The Arleigh Burke's multi-layer defense creates a hard physical problem for the cheap attacker, but it creates an equally hard economic problem for the defending fleet. And the two problems cannot be solved by the same solution. Most people assume the answer is simply to build more missiles, deeper magazines, faster reloading. It doesn't work that way, and the evidence tells a different story. Magazine depth is constrained by hull volume. The MiG-41 system on an Arleigh Burke holds 96 cells. You cannot simply add more cells without redesigning the ship. The Constellation-class frigates now entering service carry a 32-cell MiG-41, less than a third of the Burke's capacity, because the hull is smaller. Expanding the magazine means building larger ships, which costs more, which takes longer, which means fewer hulls. On paper, building enough interceptors to match every incoming cheap munition looked like a straightforward industrial problem. In practice, the production rate of SM-6 interceptors through the mid-2020s has been measured in hundreds of units per year from Raytheon's production lines, while the adversary's capacity to manufacture glide munitions at scale runs into the thousands per month. The industrial asymmetry is real, and it runs in the wrong direction for the defense. Here is the take that will probably draw some pushback. The answer to the swarm problem is not a better missile. It is a directed energy weapon that costs a few dollars per shot regardless of the incoming target's price. The Navy has known this for 2 decades. The Laser Weapon System Demonstrator on USS Ponce in 2014, the high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance system. Helios on USS Preble, the work ongoing on solid-state laser systems rated at 60 to 300 kilowatts. These programs represent the only architecture that structurally solves the cost exchange problem. A laser at operational power doesn't care whether the target costs $20,000 or $200,000. The marginal cost per shot, once the system is installed, is essentially the cost of the electricity. The obstacle is physics of a different kind. Laser weapons degrade in rain, humidity, sea spray. The operational environment of the Western Pacific is not a laser test range in Nevada. The power requirements for a weapon capable of defeating a hardened glide bomb at tactically relevant range push against the electrical generating capacity of current hull designs, and integration into the existing Aegis fire control architecture, getting the laser to hand off from radar track to engagement autonomously and reliably, remains an engineering challenge the programs are working through but have not yet fully solved. The Navy's interim answer is a combination of approaches. The hypervelocity projectile program for the existing 5-inch guns, which can fire guided rounds at substantially lower per-shot cost than interceptor missiles. The development of the SM-2 Block III-C as a lower-cost interceptor optimized against subsonic threats. And the operational concept of cueing Phalanx and RAM earlier in the engagement sequence to preserve SM-6 for the threats that actually require it. The fast, maneuvering, penetrating weapons that a cheap glide bomb is not. That last point connects directly to the paradox in our title. If the ship's commanders know that a cheap glide bomb cannot sink the ship even if it hits, if the damage expectation from a single hit or even several hits is severe but not catastrophic, then the rational response is not to shoot every incoming glide bomb with a $4 million SM-6. The rational response is to let Phalanx and Ram handle the cheap threat, accept the possibility that some rounds will get through, absorb the damage with damage control, and preserve the SM-6 magazine for the DF-26, or the supersonic anti-ship cruise missile, or the coordinated strike that could actually threaten the ship's survival. That is not a comfortable doctrine. It requires commanding officers to make real-time decisions about which incoming threats they will actively defend against and which they will, in effect, accept. It requires confidence in the ship's structural resilience that may be tested under combat conditions. It requires damage control teams that can operate under fire, with casualties, with systems partially degraded, and maintain the ship's fighting capability. But it is the logic that the physics demands. And understanding that logic is the reason this paradox matters. Let's put numbers to the fleet-level picture, because this is not about one ship in one engagement. This is about a sustained campaign in the South China Sea over days or weeks, with multiple Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Ticonderoga-class cruisers, now being phased out and replaced by the Flight 3 Burkes, operating as part of a carrier strike group centered on a Nimitz-class or Gerald R. Ford-class carrier. A standard carrier strike group in the 2020s typically includes one carrier, 2 Arleigh Burke destroyers in close escort, 1 or 2 additional Burkes in the screening ring, and a fast attack submarine. The combined interceptor magazine of the surface ships in that group runs to several hundred MiG-41 cells, not all loaded with air defense missiles. Call it 250 to 300 interceptors across the group on a mixed deployment. Now run a sustained campaign in which the adversary launches glide bomb waves every 4 to 6 hours. A tempo within the sortie capacity of land-based aviation operating from the Paracel or Spratly Island chains, or from mainland Chinese airfields within range of the South China Sea. Each wave of 40 to 60 munitions consumes, at the exchange ratios we discussed, a significant fraction of the group's interceptor inventory, after 4 to 6 waves. Roughly 24 to 36 hours of sustained pressure. The magazine depth of the strike group has fallen below the threshold at which the carrier itself is adequately protected against the more serious threat, the DF-26 or the YJ-18 supersonic anti-ship cruise missile. At that point, the group faces a decision: withdraw for resupply or continue operating with degraded air defense capacity and increased risk to the carrier. The carrier is the asset whose loss the United States Navy cannot accept in a localized conflict. Not because a carrier cannot be replaced, though the Ford-class program at $20 billion per hull makes replacement a generational commitment, but because the loss of a carrier in combat represents a strategic shock with consequences that go far beyond the tactical situation in the South China Sea. It changes the political calculus of the conflict, the confidence of allies, the resolve of decision-makers in ways that are difficult to model but impossible to ignore. This is the mechanism by which cheap glide bombs threaten a carrier strike group without ever threatening to sink an individual ship. Not by destroying the Arleigh Burke, by draining its magazine until the carrier behind it becomes exposed to the weapons that could actually threaten its survival. The question of whether the United States Navy has enough interceptor stockpiles to sustain extended operations under this kind of pressure, enough SM-6 rounds in the logistics pipeline, enough production capacity to replenish them at combat consumption rates, is one of the most sensitive readiness questions in the current defense budget debate. The publicly available information suggests that stockpiles are a concern. The 2023 and 2024 Center for Strategic and International Studies Wargame Analyses, the Congressional Budget Office assessments of naval munitions, and multiple think tank papers have all raised the same flag. Consumption rates in a high-end conflict in the Western Pacific would outpace production rates in the near term. The Navy and the Department of Defense, under both the Biden and Trump administrations, have pushed for increased production rates. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has emphasized munitions production as a priority. The industrial base, Raytheon, L3 Harris, Northrop Grumman, is expanding capacity, but manufacturing lines for complex precision weapons are not turned on overnight. The lead time from contract to delivered interceptor runs 18 to 36 months. You cannot surge production on a Monday to meet a Wednesday threat. The adversary's glide bomb production faces no comparable constraint. Unguided or minimally guided glide munitions, essentially a wing kit attached to a bomb body, can be manufactured in mass production facilities at rates that are orders of magnitude higher than precision interceptor production. The industrial asymmetry is structural, and it does not resolve quickly. Here is where the paradox folds back on itself in a way that changes the strategic picture. We established that cheap glide bombs cannot easily sink an Arleigh Burke. We established that they can deplete its magazine. We established that magazine depletion creates risk for the carrier the Burke is protecting. But now consider the adversary's problem from the other direction. To credibly threaten a carrier strike group in the open ocean, not near a coastline, not in confined waters, but in the deep water of the Western Pacific, the adversary needs not just glide bombs, it needs targeting data. A glide bomb released from an aircraft at standoff range needs to know where the carrier strike group is, which ship is the carrier, and where exactly the carrier is at the moment of release. For a group that is actively maneuvering, operating emissions control, and protected by electronic warfare, the E/A-18G Growler jamming aircraft assigned to carrier air wings exists specifically for this purpose. Accurate targeting data is not trivial to obtain and maintain. The PLA's solution to the targeting problem is the Reconnaissance Strike Complex, a layered system of satellites, over-the-horizon radar, maritime patrol aircraft, and surface ships and submarines that together build a targeting picture. But every element of that targeting chain is itself a vulnerability. The reconnaissance satellite in a predictable orbit has known windows. The maritime patrol aircraft must enter the carrier's defensive perimeter to get close enough for precision targeting. The OTH radar can be jammed or deceived. This is why the E/A-18G Growler, the electronic attack variant of the Super Hornet assigned in dedicated squadrons to carrier air wings, is arguably the most strategically important aircraft in the current naval order of battle. It is not a strike aircraft. It does not carry the big weapons. But it degrades the adversary's ability to target the strike group, and without accurate targeting, the most expensive anti-ship missile in the world cannot find the carrier. The research angle here is sobering. I spent considerable time going through the open-source discussion of PLA targeting chain vulnerabilities, and one element keeps coming up that doesn't make the news. The space-based component of the targeting system, the constellation of maritime surveillance satellites operated by China, has grown dramatically over the last decade, and the growth rate suggests they have taken the targeting problem seriously. As of the mid-2020s, China operates several dozen dedicated maritime surveillance satellites, with revisit times over major ocean areas that have shortened from hours to tens of minutes. That trend runs in the wrong direction for a strike group trying to hide. The offset, on the US side, is a combination of active electronic denial, the Growler's jamming capability, the ship's own EW suite, and passive measures, emissions control, irregular movement patterns, operating at distances that extend the adversary's targeting chain to its limits. At sufficiently long range, even a well-targeted glide bomb that clears every layer of defense faces the simple problem that a 50-kilogram warhead dropped from a wing kit does not have infinite range. Most designs in this class have unpowered glide ranges of 30 to 60 kilometers from release altitude. The aircraft carrying them must close to within that range of the target. And at that range, it enters the defensive envelope of not just the destroyers, but potentially the carrier's own air wing, with F/A-18 Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning II aircraft providing combat air patrol. The attacker's geometry is constrained from both ends. Too far out, the munition doesn't reach the target. Too close in, the delivery aircraft is inside the carrier's air defense perimeter. The corridor in between is where the real engagement happens. Stepping back, what strikes me about this situation is that neither side has solved the problem it most needs to solve. The adversary has a cheap, scalable weapon that creates genuine economic pressure on the defense but cannot reliably deliver the physical damage needed to neutralize the target. The defender has a layered system of extraordinary sophistication that is economically unsustainable at the exchange ratios the adversary is exploiting. Both sides are investing heavily in the tools that might break the deadlock: directed energy weapons, hypersonic missiles, autonomous systems, expanded magazine depth. And neither side is there yet. That unresolved tension is what drives the pace of procurement and the urgency of shipbuilding on both sides. Beijing's shipyards, operating at a rate that produces more naval tonnage annually than all US shipyards combined, are building not just destroyers, but a layered strike complex that includes the Renhai-class Type 055 cruiser, a 10,000-ton warship with 112 VLS cells, and the Fujian carrier, a conventional takeoff barrier arrested recovery vessel that represents a significant step in PLA power projection capability. And the U.S. Navy's own shipbuilding program is under sustained pressure from congressional auditors, the Congressional Research Service, and the Government Accountability Office for cost overruns and delivery delays that compress the numerical advantage the United States held in the early decades of this competition. The Arleigh Burke production line, 30 hulls completed, multiple in construction at Bath Iron Works in Maine and Huntington Ingalls Industries in Mississippi, continues, but at a rate that does not fully offset retirements and the growing sophistication of the threat. The Flight 3 program, with its AN/SPY-6 radar and enhanced combat system, represents a genuine capability upgrade. But the gap between what the radar can detect and what the magazine can intercept at sustainable economic cost remains unresolved. Will the U.S. Navy close the directed energy gap before the adversary's glide bomb production scales beyond what conventional interceptors can manage? We'd genuinely like to know what you think. Comment yes or no on whether you believe laser weapons will be operationally deployable on surface combatants before 2030. The engineering is closer than most people assume, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Let's close the loop on the paradox. The title asks why a $20,000 glide bomb cannot sink what a $3 million missile could in the South China Sea. The answer runs through physics, economics, and operational doctrine simultaneously. The physics answer: a warhead in the 50 to 100 kilogram class, even if it defeats every layer of defense and strikes the hull of an Arleigh Burke, delivers insufficient energy to overcome the structural resilience, compartmentalization, and damage control capability of a 9,000-ton warship designed to survive hits and keep fighting. Sinking a ship of that class requires either a weapon designed to exploit a specific structural vulnerability, the keel shot of a heavyweight torpedo, the deep penetrating warhead of a ballistic anti-ship missile, or a volume of hits that the cheap munitions economics and the carrier strike group's defensive depth make very difficult to guarantee. The economic answer: the cheap glide bomb is extraordinarily effective at what it actually does, which is drain the defense's interceptor magazine at an exchange ratio that favors the attacker. This is a real threat. It is not hypothetical. It is the reason directed energy weapons, magazine expansion, and production rate increases have moved to the top of the naval procurement priority list. But draining the magazine and sinking the ship are different outcomes with different strategic consequences. The operational answer: a competent defending commander, understanding both the physics and the economics, does not treat every incoming glide bomb as a ship killer requiring an SM-6 response. The layered architecture of Aegis: SM-6 at long range, ESSM in the mid-tier, RAM at close range, Phalanx as the final automated barrier, is designed precisely to match the interceptor to the threat level. Phalanx and RAM can handle subsonic, non-maneuvering glide munitions at a fraction of the cost of SM-6, preserving the expensive interceptors for the threats that actually require them. The fast, maneuvering, penetrating weapons that target survivability rather than magazine depth. The paradox resolves into a doctrine: accept some damage, preserve the magazine, protect the carrier. It is not comfortable. It has consequences for the crew, for the ship, for the political optics of a warship that shows damage in a conflict that has not escalated to full war. But it is the logic the physics demands, and the navies that understand it will make better decisions than the navies that treat every incoming munition as existential. The strategic cost of this situation extends beyond any individual engagement. It is measured in readiness cycles, deployment tempo, in the fatigue that accumulates across a fleet that has been operating at high operational pace in the Pacific and the Middle East simultaneously for the better part of 3 decades. An Arleigh Burke crew, approximately 300 officers and enlisted sailors on a Flight Type hull, operates on deployment cycles that have in recent years averaged 7 to 9 months away from home port. The maintenance demands of operating complex electronics and propulsion in a saltwater environment at sustained high tempo have pushed maintenance backlogs at naval shipyards to levels that have drawn repeated criticism from the Navy's own Inspector General. Ships have at times deployed with known maintenance deferrals because the operational demand exceeded the capacity of the shipyard maintenance pipeline to fully prepare them. That is the human and industrial cost that sits behind the tactical mathematics. The magazine depth problem and the structural resilience of the hull are engineering questions with engineering answers. The readiness of the crew, the depth of the maintenance pipeline, the production rate of the shipyards that support the fleet. These are systemic questions that do not resolve on the same timeline as the engineering. One thing about this problem that is counterintuitive on the surface: it wasn't supposed to get here. The United States Navy emerged from the Cold War with a surface fleet that faced no peer competitor at sea. The 30-year window from 1991 to roughly 2020 was a period of American naval dominance so complete that the questions of fleet size, production rates, and magazine depth seemed almost academic. The growth of PLA naval capability, the scale of Chinese shipbuilding, which has been running at annual construction rates that no U.S. program can match in pure tonnage, and the deliberate investment in asymmetric weapons like the DF-21D and the glide bomb swarm concept have brought those academic questions back to the center of real operational planning. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is one of the most capable warships ever built. Its Aegis system, its weapons suite, its damage control architecture, and the quality of the crews that operate it represent a genuine standard of excellence in naval engineering. But it operates in a competitive environment that has changed more in the last decade than it did in the 3 decades before. And the paradox we have been examining: cheap weapons that cannot sink the ship but can drain its ability to defend itself, is the central tactical expression of that changed environment. Put yourself in the position of a Pacific Fleet commander building an operational plan today. The assets you have are real, capable, and sophisticated. The challenge you face is also real. An adversary with a large and growing fleet, land-based aviation at short range, an increasingly capable targeting chain, and a munitions production capacity that can sustain pressure at exchange ratios that favor the attacker economically. The solutions available: directed energy, distributed maritime operations, increased magazine depth, expanded production, are all real, but none of them fully resolve the problem on the timeline the threat demands. The math has no clean answer. That is not a failure of the defense. It is the nature of the problem. So here's the question we leave you with. And it is a real one, not rhetorical, because the answer actually matters for how you think about Pacific naval strategy in the years ahead. If a swarm of cheap glide munitions can deplete the magazine of an Arleigh Burke without sinking it, if the ship survives the attack but the carrier behind it is now exposed because the destroyer's interceptors are spent, which response doctrine makes more sense? Spend every interceptor to maintain the full defensive umbrella, accepting that the magazine runs dry faster? Or accept some hits, preserve the SM-6 and ESSM rounds for the weapons that can actually threaten the carrier, and trust that the ship's damage control capability and structural resilience absorb what gets through? Both doctrines have a cost. Both have a logic. The first preserves the crew and the ship from damage. The second preserves the carrier from exposure. Neither is obviously right, and the real operational answer probably lives somewhere between them, calibrated by the threat mix, the geometry, and the intelligence picture at the moment of engagement. We will be breaking down what the actual wargame analyses have concluded about this trade-off, including the classified but leaked assessments that have circulated in defense analysis circles, in the next breakdown. If you want that one, the subscribe button is the fastest way to make sure you see it when it drops. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Which doctrine would you choose, and why? We read every one.